I need to emphasize that it is indeed the commitment of this administration to translate our human rights activities into practical accomplishments. Pronouncements that serve only to make us feel righteous are not what we would view as accomplishments. What we are looking for are results that benefit victims of, or potential victims of human rights abuses. That is why we try to fine-tune our policy so as to achieve optimal results in specific situations in specific countries. If we exercise what we refer to as quiet diplomacy, it is because we think that that is the best way of getting a positive response to our appeals. If our appeals fail to achieve the desired results, or if it is evident that private communications would not achieve any results, we do go public. In those cases, too, we resort to public exposure of the issue, not for the sake of satisfying ourselves that we have pronounced our ideas on the subject, but in order to achieve the desired result, namely that of shaming the human rights violator through adverse publicity into modifying its behavior.
In the past two administrations, human rights has become a more salient feature of American foreign policy. This is an interesting link between the Carter and Reagan foreign policies and an interesting aspect of America's contemporary approach to the international order. The exact nature of this policy and what to emphasize within its subject is a substantial debate, and the issues it raises are most urgent for many Americans. We are fortunate to be joined this evening to discuss the United States human rights policy by the senior State Department officer responsible for it, the Honorable Richard Schifter, Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Born in Vienna, Ambassador Schifter is a graduate of the College of the City of New York and Yale Law School. His home state is Maryland, where he has been well known to many of you for his service on various boards and commissions, included in the 20 years of membership in Maryland State Board of Education, including 8 years as Vice President and 4 as President. He has served as a member of the United Nations Rights on Commission since 1983. He served as Deputy United Nations Representative in the Security Council during 1984-85 and was appointed to his present position as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs in November of 1985. It's a great pleasure to introduce this evening's distinguished guest, the Honorable Richard Schifter. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Let me say at the outset that indeed the speech that I've prepared tries to deal with the questions just posed. What I've tried to do in my prepared text is to speak of the historical background of our human rights policy and then proceed by explaining how we got to where we are in terms of the general framework. My thought was that I would not, in my initial remarks, speak about specific situations. I don't mean to avoid them, though, and in our question and answer period, to the extent to which I can try to cover specific situations, I'll be happy to do so.
Louder, please.
Okay. Last November, just prior to the meeting between President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev in Geneva, I met with a group of European journalists whom I was to brief on the human rights aspects of the forthcoming summit meeting. The first question, which was put to me, was why human rights was on the agenda of the meeting. The principal issues for discussion at the summit, these journalists thought, were arms reduction and the avoidance of nuclear war. Why, they asked, do we introduce extraneous topics into the discussion which might hinder efforts to attain harmony between the world's two principal military powers? A somewhat similar position was taken by one of our foremost thinkers on diplomatic affairs, George Kennan, in a recent article in the magazine Foreign Affairs. The United States, Kennan suggested, has important geopolitical and economic objectives in the world. These should be pursued without our being deflected by efforts to advance the cause of democracy and human rights. In some countries, he noted, democracy may not be the most suitable form of government anyway. It is indeed worth noting that the 1985 summit is the first one as to which it was announced in advance that the issue of human rights would be taken up as a distinct topic. No similar announcement was made as to the agenda of the 1979 meeting between President Carter and Chairman Brezhnev, nor was the human rights issue a topic of discussion at any previous summit. Yet, in 1985, it would have been considered surprising and, in fact, dismaying if the President had not taken up the human rights issue at Geneva. It is obvious that human rights as a significant and central element of American foreign policy is, on one hand, of fairly recent origin, yet, on the other hand, is now solidly entrenched as an aspect of our foreign policy. What the George Kennan piece makes clear is that traditional diplomats do indeed consider it unwise to pursue in the conduct of foreign affairs goals other than those defined by American geopolitical and economic concerns. That indeed may be an important reason why in years past human rights considerations were not in the forefront of American foreign policy. The change to a more activist position of the United States government concerning human rights came about gradually during the last 12 years, principally as a result of legislative mandates. These mandates, in turn, are the result of the truly unique outlook of the American people on their relations with foreign countries. It is an outlook which is the result of the combined effect of geographic, historic, and demographic factors, as well as the very unique character of the American ethic. First of all, we are a country which for more than 130 years has felt secure between the two oceans, assured that our immediate neighbors would not endanger our peace. Even today, in the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, a good many Americans seem to view a nuclear war as an abstract threat to our survival, rather than visualizing it as the result of an attack on the United States by a specific country, namely the Soviet Union. Our geography has had understandable consequences as far as our history is concerned. Because our country's population and economic strength had made it the foremost power on the North American continent, the role of the colonial powers became in this part of the world increasingly immaterial. I'm now referring to the 19th century. We no longer had to be concerned with what England or France or Spain thought of us or thought of doing to us. And then there's the matter of demography. Our country is overwhelmingly a country of immigrants. A good many Americans, particularly those whose families arrived here during the last 100 years, have maintained a continuing interest in their countries of birth or ancestry. They share with Americans whose families arrived here earlier a relatively low level of concern over the traditional problems of foreign relations, what diplomats refer to as bilateral questions. They are less concerned with the question of what a particular foreign government might do vis-à-vis the United States, but far more what it is doing to their own peoples, the brothers and sisters or the first or second cousins of American citizens. This direct concern with the fate of close and distant relatives fuses with the broader interest in humanity which is part of the general American ethic. The result is a general American concern in the behavior of foreign governments vis-à-vis their own peoples. In other words, a concern with human rights. Let me use this opportunity to say a word about the American ethic. Having been born and raised in Europe, I have the advantage of being able to make comparisons between the American and the European outlook on world affairs. Also, as a non-native, I'm less inclined to be charged with ethnocentrism. What my wife, whose background is similar to mine, and I have often discussed during our years together, has been our appreciation of the true generosity, broad-mindedness, and empathy characteristic of the great mass of Americans. Whenever and wherever a natural disaster occurs, we consider it to be our responsibility to spring into action, to help in whatever way we can, through governmental action and through the assistance by non-governmental organizations and individuals. Just as we are so concerned about disasters resulting from natural causes, we're equally concerned about disasters resulting from man-made causes. We, as a country, do indeed believe in being our brother's keepers. This ethic is consistent with, and in large part derived from, the basic and unifying political principle on which our governmental structure is built. This principle, expressed in our Declaration of Independence, is that governments are instituted for the purpose of protecting the innate and unalienable rights of human beings. What we need to note in this context is that most other nations, including the European democracies, have governments which evolved out of societies in which the individual viewed himself as a servant of the sovereign. Our country, by contrast, is one in which the political ideals of the settlers of Plymouth prevailed, who viewed their government as their own creation, responsible to serving them. Let me add that over the years I've noted that only Americans will consistently discuss the actions of their government in the first person plural. We refer to our government and to our country as we. Europeans generally refer to it as they. These, then, are the elements which make up the American concern for human rights in the world. Our historical freedom from immediate threats to our national independence, the family ties and residual feelings of national identification that link many Americans to the countries from which they or their ancestors emigrated, the feelings of brotherhood and empathy which are so much a part of the American character, and the fundamental reason for the existence of our system of government, the protection of individual rights. This general American outlook, which I've just described, was for a long time not translated into our day-to-day relations with foreign countries, largely for the reasons stated in the Kennan article to which I referred earlier. The general outlook at the State Department was in keeping with long-standing diplomatic tradition that the domestic actions of foreign governments were not matters which we should seek to influence. Such inchoate feelings as there might have been in the Congress to factor human rights concerns into our diplomacy could not easily translate themselves into American policy because the task of formulating foreign policy was one which under the Constitution was vested in the executive branch. But as the Congress became more determined to assert itself with regard to human rights, legislative vehicles were found to transmit binding policy directives concerning human rights to the executive branch. The first such vehicle was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act. It geared the granting of most favored nation status to a country's performance with regard to emigration. Other enactments tying executive action to human rights performance followed. Human rights issues were thus to be considered in granting military and economic assistance to foreign countries, in granting export licenses for law enforcement equipment, and in voting on loans from international lending institutions. Included in this package were the laws which provided for the submission by the State Department to the Congress of annual reports on the human rights performance of countries throughout the world, as well as the law which established the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. These last two laws have been extraordinarily effective in institutionalizing the concern for human rights in the State Department. Creation of the office of the Assistant Secretary gave a person with significant standing in the State Department hierarchy and the staff working with this person the responsibility for seeing to it that human rights concerns were appropriately dealt with throughout the department. Perhaps even more important, though, was the law requiring the filing of the annual reports on country human rights practices. The first draft of the individual country reports is prepared by the staff of the embassies serving in the country in question. Responsibility for writing such reports is assigned in each embassy to one or more Foreign Service officers who must, as a consequence, make it their business to monitor human rights developments year-round. Once these matters are focused on, they're also reported on as soon as they occur. The report, in turn, will often trigger instructions to take action, either as a result of the initiative of the regional bureau having responsibility for the country in question, or as a result of the initiative of the Human Rights Bureau. Though statutory directives are important, the personality of the individuals whose task it is to supervise the execution of these laws is equally important. That was particularly true in the case of the human rights laws, which ran, after all, against the grain of traditional diplomacy. It was necessary for a large bureaucracy to rethink an aspect of its work. It is in this context that I would like to pay special tribute to my immediate predecessor, Elliott Abrams, who deserves special credit for having done more than any other single person, in my opinion, to integrate human rights concerns effectively into the operations of the State Department. Just how he did it might very well be the topic for another speech. I should add, of course, that Mr. Abrams would not have succeeded if his approach had not been in complete harmony with the philosophy of life of the Secretary of State and the President. The introduction of human rights concerns into our own foreign policy is not unrelated to similar developments in the foreign policy of other democracies. Through the human rights activities of the United Nations system, a good many countries have indeed had occasion to express themselves on human rights problems throughout the world. The break with the past in which countries would not normally comment specifically on what it is that other countries do to their own citizens, was made, not surprisingly, in the case of South Africa. It is in this context particularly interesting to note how the case of South Africa evolved in the United Nations system. The issue was first raised in 1946 as a traditional problem, as a matter of disagreement between two independent nations, namely India and South Africa. In this early stage, the focus was only on the question of discrimination in South Africa against persons of Indian ancestry. But over time, the narrowness of this treatment of the issue became increasingly clear, and the United Nations took up apartheid as a general problem involving the entire discriminated against population. The participants in that activity may not even have been aware of the fact that they were setting a major milestone. That is, however, what they did back in 1952, even though it took years for the United Nations system to take the next step, to focus attention on domestic human rights violations of a second country. That second country happened to be Chile. Somoza's Nicaragua came third. A few other Latin American countries on the Soviet blacklist followed, causing us to call attention to the double standard practiced by the United Nations in the human rights field. It is fair to say that as a result of our consistent urgings, there has indeed been a broadening in recent years of the countries discussed in United Nations human rights debates. But such broader discussions, which include detailed analyses of human rights violations by the Soviet Union, are truly of very recent origin. I believe it is fair to say that in these recent years in which we have defined our own human rights policy, we have adopted an approach which effectively coordinates our human rights stance in international fora with our bilateral relations with the countries whose records we discuss in the international fora. It is my impression that some of the other members of these international organizations, other democracies that is, tend to express themselves vigorously in a body such as the United Nations Human Rights Commission, but are less inclined to follow through consistently in their own bilateral concerns. They seem to hold to the view that they have done their duty in the cause of human rights by expressing themselves in the United Nations setting and tend to leave the matter there. This brings me necessarily to my last point, which is what is accomplished by our various efforts in the field of human rights. I need to emphasize that it is indeed the commitment of this administration to translate our human rights activities into practical accomplishments. Pronouncements that serve only to make us feel righteous are not what we would view as accomplishments. What we are looking for are results that benefit victims of, or potential victims of human rights abuses. That is why we try to fine-tune our policy so as to achieve optimal results in specific situations in specific countries. If we exercise what we refer to as quiet diplomacy, it is because we think that that is the best way of getting a positive response to our appeals. If our appeals fail to achieve the desired results, or if it is evident that private communications would not achieve any results, we do go public. In those cases, too, we resort to public exposure of the issue, not for the sake of satisfying ourselves that we have pronounced our ideas on the subject, but in order to achieve the desired result, namely that of shaming the human rights violator through adverse publicity into modifying its behavior. In all that we do, we must of course recognize that we are not practicing in a field which permits us to calculate precisely what the right solution might be to any given problem. What we do is collect the relevant information and then decide on the course of action which we believe to be most likely to lead to the desired result. Though we have been able to chalk up some successes, we are the first ones to concede that our approaches still require further analysis and refinement. Through trial and error, we hope over time to build on what we have accomplished so far and thus improve our record of performance. I can thus assure you that the basic attitude of the American people, a people which cares, which wants to help end suffering wherever it occurs, is translated into concrete action by the United States government. We cannot promise that we shall always succeed, but we try. We really try. Thank you.
Ambassador Schifter, we thank you for that carefully crafted presentation and such a nice introduction to our question and answer period. I'll repeat the questions for the benefit of our television cameras. You may ask the questions either from the floor or from one of the two microphones in the back of the room if you would like. Yes, sir, on the far left.
Your Excellency, I would like to know how the United States government regards the oppression of ethnic Turkish minority in Bulgaria.
That particular question can be identified via the microphone system. Yes, sir.
I have spoken on that on quite a number of occasions at the Helsinki human rights experts meeting, and again at the United Nations, both in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Commission. For people who do not know, the situation is as follows. In Bulgaria, there are about 1 million people, close to 10% of the population, who are ethnically Turkish. They had until recently Turkish names, wore traditional Turkish clothes, were Muslim by religion, practiced Muslim rites, would attend mosques. About 2 years ago, the Bulgarian government decided that they were going to be, from then on, Bulgarians, and they would go into the area, eastern part of Bulgaria, that is a predominantly Turkish population. They compelled people to change their names. In other words, it wasn't a matter of choice, it was a matter of their being instructed to change their names to Bulgarian names. one of the strangest aspects of it would be that a Muslim religious functionary, for example, a mufti, would in this communist country change his name to Christos. It sort of underlined the strange aspect of this. Turks were discouraged from speaking their own language, teaching the language to their children, dressing as Turks, and are in, as a matter of fact, also were discouraged from attending mosques. Mosques were permitted to fall into disrepair, and in other ways were discouraged from practicing their religion, all in the name of turning them into Bulgarians. I personally discussed the matter, as a matter of fact, with the Bulgarian ambassador in Washington, and he gave me sort of a number of options, maybe of interest to you, as to how to analyze the situation. He said, number one, there were hardly any Turks left in Bulgaria after World War II. Then he said, number two, if there were any left, they all left in the 70s. Number three, if there still were any left, they all have voluntarily become Bulgarians because the communist government of Bulgaria has been so uplifting for them and has raised them to a much higher level. And fourth, besides, he said, if you just go into the attics, you will find icons dating back to the 15th century, which prove beyond any doubt that these people were once Christians and Bulgarians and had been forcibly converted to being Muslims and Turks. Well, I, as you can imagine, rejected all four of these possibilities, and our government has very clearly spoken out on this subject. Again, the question arises of what it accomplishes. There's no doubt that the Bulgarians are extremely nervous about being held up to opprobrium on this. And by the way, they go around and say the whole campaign, the whole effort is something that is initiated by the CIA, that there's no truth to all of this. There are no Turks in Bulgaria.
Yes, sir.
One of the signatories of the Helsinki Agreement was the Soviet Union, and yet probably one of its greatest violators. What has the State Department done vis-a-vis this situation?
The question is, what has the State Department done vis-a-vis whatever violations may have occurred by the Soviet Union of the Helsinki Accords?
First of all, it's absolutely right that they are in serious violation. The last thing that I did, I want you to know, is just about 3 hours ago, read a statement that it's going to be broadcast to Russia. It probably has been broadcast by now this afternoon, commemorating this being the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Moscow Helsinki Monitoring Group, which has been disbanded by now with many of its leaders in prison or in exile. The point is that we have, over a period of time, emphasized, whenever we have the opportunity to do so at international meetings, that the Soviet Union is in violation. What you can ultimately achieve then is, of course, the challenge. I have suggested here that by speaking up on the subject, by emphasizing and re-emphasizing it, we hope ultimately to shame them into changing their outlook and policies. It's not easy. It would be easier, I would say, if all of our friends and allies were to join us in a unanimous chorus. Some of them, in all fairness, do, but it would be nice to have more people in the chorus.
Gentleman with the microphone, please.
Yes, Secretary Schifter. I have a question, but I'd like to preface it with an introduction, if I may. I'm Mort Winston. I'm with Amnesty International in Baltimore, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to hear you speak. I'm also a philosophy professor, and I want to tell a little story. A couple of weeks ago, I went to an international conference in St. Louis, and there I read a paper concerning U.S. human rights policy and its relationship to our nuclear policy. Summarizing rapidly, I argued in this paper that when the Reagan administration came into power, it reversed the human rights policy of the Carter years and adopted what I called a double standard policy, in which it went heavy and loud on human rights criticisms in countries which we perceive as our ideological adversaries, such as the Soviet Union, and then also went rather quietly criticizing countries that we perceive to be our ideological or strategic allies. However, I argued, and this is the question, finally, I said that it was my perception that recently there had been a wind shift in the administration's policy under your guidance and Secretary Schultz's guidance towards a more even-handed policy. And the question is that true?
The question is, in spite of what is suggested to be an early Reagan administration double standard, being easy on your friends and hard on your opponents, has there not been a shift to a more even-handed policy thanks to a great extent to your wisdom, sir?
The answer, I'm afraid, is no. Let me try to explain. In 1981, and I want to say I have, as my biographical sketch indicated, have been involved in these matters for a period longer than just my incumbency in my present office as Assistant Secretary. In 1981, there was this general assumption in the media about a fundamental change in outlook as far as the United States government is concerned. That is not what happened. There was indeed a change in tactics, and it was the change that, in a way, you have referred to, and the one that I referred to in my own talk. What we try to do is calculate in a particular situation what policy on our part would be best suited to achieve the result that we want to achieve, where we believe that we can get furthest by engaging in what we call quiet diplomacy. We do that. Now, let me just define what quiet diplomacy means. It means nothing other than that you don't go to the media with the matter. It doesn't mean that your ambassador in the foreign country whispers to the other side. He can speak in very strong terms, and that is precisely what we do. We make it very clear what our concerns are. We can, at a certain point, go even further in signaling our displeasure, but what we generally try to do is use the appeal to the media only as a last resort, only when we believe that the other approaches that we have tried to use have failed. Now, it so happens, and quite understandably, that countries with which we have some sort of relationship that are outside the Soviet sphere are more amenable to quiet diplomacy, that they would respond to them. Soviet Union, by and large, will not. But I want to tell you that, for example, we get places with Romania through quiet diplomacy, through a lot of discussion and a lot of exchanges of thinking back and forth. And under those circumstances, in the case of Romania, which after all is a member of the Warsaw Pact too, we gradually work things out. Same is true with Hungary. Wherever, or for that matter, with regard to another country really in the communist sphere, well, not in the communist sphere, but a country which claims to have a communist government, Yugoslavia, we by and large try to talk to the people in the ministries, raise our questions, raise our concerns, see whether we can get them resolved at that level. And wherever we can do it that way, that's the way we do it. We go public, as I say, when there's no other no other option available. And you see what happened recently, what caused that article that Bernie Wertzman wrote in the New York Times was that we did make a public statement on Chile. But the fact of, and I guess I made that statement that got into the papers, but the fact of the matter is that the first public statement on Chile that I made was in the fall of 1984. And it just didn't get picked up at that time. I made another statement in the spring of 1985. There was another public statement in the fall of 1985 by Ambassador Byrne. And mine was the fourth in a row, and that one finally got picked up.
Yes, sir.
Has there been any instance which you might cite where we've used economic leverage against a country successfully? The one time we attempted in Afghanistan when we started the government for the country invaded Afghanistan. I understand that was a failure in part. Can you cite us any other instances where we did so successfully?
Well, let me just tell you, until the jury, I'm sorry, go ahead.
He caught himself.
Yes.
We try to prep our speakers on this, but the urge to answer is powerful. The question was, have there been any examples of the success of economic leverage upon other countries? Apparently it didn't work with respect to Afghanistan.
The jury's still out, and we hope there's going to be success in Haiti's progress toward democracy. But in the case of Haiti, the signal that we sent was that we were not going to make the necessary finding that would allow additional economic assistance to flow to Haiti. That was what I believe was a very significant factor in terms of the various elements in Haiti that then decided to see to it that Jean-Claude Duvalier would leave the presidency. So that's a recent example where our decision not to go forward with further economic assistance played a role.
Mr. Blumberg, please.
A very simple question. In South Korea, there are over 40,000 American troops and several thousand civilians. As a matter of policy, Armed Forces Television has been carrying American television broadcasts, Ted Koppel, 60 Minutes, the whole business. Every now and then, however, the American ambassador in Seoul, South Korea, Ambassador Walker, has decided that in order to appease a cruel military dictatorship that routinely tortures its citizens, that he censors news that Americans are entitled under at least some liberal interpretation of the First Amendment. The question is a very simple one. Does the State Department approve of Ambassador Walker censoring news that Americans have a full right to receive?
The question of Mr. Blumberg is, does the State Department approve the censoring of news which American troops in Korea or other Americans should have a right to hear?
First of all, let me say that I seriously doubt that Ambassador Walker has anything to do with news programming in South Korea. I have an appointment to see him tomorrow morning, and I will pose this specific question to him and find out more about what you have just said. Let me also say that while there are serious human rights concerns that we do have with regard to the government of South Korea, you have vastly overdrawn the characterization of it. It is a country which is in a process of moving toward democracy, and we are quite confident that it will be there within the next few years. We are certainly hopeful that this process is going to be moving forward at an accelerated pace. I also believe that while indeed, as I have had occasion to say to the ambassador from South Korea, even one case of torture is one case too many. To speak of the government, as you put it, torturing people, its people routinely, is simply not in correlation with the facts.
May I have a short follow-up? If it's a fact that television programs have been dropped. Now, if Ambassador Walker is not responsible, is any other American official responsible?
The follow-up.
I want to say that I will, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
The follow-up question is any American official involved in news censorship in South Korea?
I will put the question to the ambassador tomorrow. I'm quite certain that State Department personnel doesn't run radio programs, but I will, or television programs, but I will find out.
Thank you.
They might not be the highest rated programs if they did. One has a certain image of the State Department which isn't...
My assumption would be that it would be, if a problem of this kind exists, that the Army is, as at least is the case in other parts of the world, where the Army is responsible for broadcasts to Army personnel.
Again, at the same microphone, yes.
On Soviet Jewry, the record seems to indicate that whenever the Soviets have reason to hope for detente with the United States, they relax the pressure on their Jewish citizens and allow more of them to emigrate, and that the reverse is true when the hopes are low. My question is simple and very naive. Do you think that with the forthcoming meetings of Secretary Shultz and Shevardnadze and Reagan and Gorbachev, that there is any reason to hope that there will be this relaxation of tensions that will have some happy result?
Do you believe there's much of a chance of relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in the near future?
I think what, as far as the history is concerned, what ought to be kept in mind is that the first time that when a very substantial decline in immigration and the issuance of new visas to Soviet Jews began, when the first drop came, it was in October 1979, very shortly after the signing of SALT II, and before the Senate had taken any action. God knows what it is that makes the Soviets behave the way they do, but let's just keep the dates in mind. Now, shortly after that came the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in December, but the drop in the issuance of visas preceded the invasion of Afghanistan and the change in foreign policy. Now, a change in our bilateral relations. There's no doubt, however, that one of the things that they hope to do is to impress the United States at any one time with a willingness to cooperate by letting Soviet Jews out of the country. So far, they have not indicated anything like that. Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union is now lower than it was even last year. We'll see what happens.
Senator Michael.
I'd like to ask a question of Nicaragua. Now, I think that you're right in saying that different countries warrant different methods to address their human rights problems. And I do believe that there are human rights abuses in Nicaragua, mainly the oppression of the Mosquito Indians. But I think that there's also a mixed bag in Nicaragua. There's also, what I hear, improvements of literacy rates in Nicaragua and efforts for land reform. Now, the question is that the United States seems to have chosen this method of addressing the human rights abuses in Nicaragua, the funding of the Contras trying to overthrow Nicaragua. Now, why was that method chosen? And can you explain how it works?
Would you relate the Contras' presence with an approach to human rights?
Again, I'd like to go back in the history here. The Sandinista Revolution occurred in July 1979. From July 1979 to October 1980, for a period of 15 months, Sandinistas received substantial economic assistance from the United States, both directly from the government and from private sources. 15 months. It was, however, during these 15 months, during which it became increasingly evident that people who were followers of essentially the Leninist persuasion were taking control of Nicaragua and were eliminating from the country and from the Sandinista leadership all those people who had not been devout Leninists, to the point that by October 1980, and this is something the Carter administration recognized at that time, the country was essentially under control of the kind of people that looked to Cuba for guidance and leadership. It was in the period that followed that rather significant elements in Nicaragua organized themselves in opposition. And by the way, there are a lot of people there who are in opposition to the government. And there's no doubt that these have received United States support.
Professor Ryu.
If I didn't have this chance to ask you questions and thus hearing your response, I would walk away with an impression that you and the office you represent, the Office of Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, are doing their best, and they're actually very best. I would walk away convinced without any trouble, but I don't still believe the government you represent, the people you try to make the best out of, are doing their best. I'd like to ask you a question, not so much to the incumbent of the office you represent, but as more of a human terms, the name implies that sort of supersedes, stands above the interests of nation states and ideologies. Now, I believe that the American public are understandably ambivalent to the affairs of the third world. On the one hand, they are led to the very understandable history and heritage for democracy and human rights. On the other hand, they see the necessity for compromising it for the sake of national security. Both are understandable concerns. And now, as an expert of human rights, how do you believe the strategic necessity should be defined by the United States? And also, you talked about quiet diplomacy, which I believe is necessary. But also, one has to believe that when one condones quiet diplomacy, one also condones the lack of quiet diplomacy, for we don't see any of it. Now, how can the public support or not support the claims of quiet diplomacy in advance of human rights? I have some other related questions, but because of time, I'll stop here.
Every professor is more skilled at answering questions than asking them, of course, and we share that particular knowledge. I'm not sure what the question was.
Let me try to respond anyway.
You can repeat whatever you think the question was.
In the first instance, I ought to make it clear, the government that I represent is the government of the United States of America, a government that has a mandate from the people and duly, in elections in which it was duly elected. Last case by, if I remember correctly, 58% of the American voters. It has a mandate from the country. It's the government of the United States, not an administration associated with a particular name. Now, as far as the government of the United States is concerned, it has a responsibility, it seems to me, to try its very best to discharge its functions on behalf of the people of the United States. When it comes to the issue of quiet diplomacy, Fact of the matter is that anyone who is really interested in following it closely will get in general terms an understanding of what it is that we are doing. That is, however, what quiet diplomacy is about. We don't necessarily broadcast it before the fact. We can, however, engage in discussions after the fact, and frequently do. I guess that is the question you asked. I've answered it. Well, oh yes. Now, as far as national security is concerned, undoubtedly situations do arise from time to time, and let me perhaps put it this way. Any government must, in the first instance, make its decision on the basis of what it is that is critical in order to support and defend one's own country. And that means that as far as our foreign policy objectives are concerned, in the first instance, there must be to evaluate, as we look at a particular situation, what the dangers to us might be in that setting. We, as distinct from a great many other countries in the world, as a matter of fact, I would say as distinct from most other countries in the world, then throw human rights into the equation, and in some situations put a security concern aside to advance a human rights concern. But if I were to give you an example where I think we don't press it very hard, I would say it's in the case of the People's Republic of China. It's a country of 1 billion people with whom we want to have good relations. And to the extent to which we would speak a great deal about human rights problems in China, I think we are satisfied we'll get nowhere. It's not going to accomplish any good. So that is an issue that we don't press very hard. I think it would be fair to say we don't press very hard for women's rights in Saudi Arabia.
At the far microphone, yes.
Mr. Secretary, what I would like to do, I'd appreciate it if you would update us on Cambodia, Zimbabwe, and Angola. Is that a government of democracy or one-party rule, and how are the people being treated?
Would you comment on the situation in Cambodia, Kampuchea, Zimbabwe, and Angola?
Cambodia is, at this point, ruled by a government installed by the Vietnamese occupiers of Cambodia. We have not recognized that government, have no relations with it. There's some assistance that goes to the opposition, but as far as the opposition is concerned, we have friendly discussions with the democratic elements, not with the survivors of the Pol Pot government. It's a very, very sad situation. Cambodia is supposed to be a country of fine, wonderful, warm people, and they have had a series of great misfortunes. And right now, as I say, most of the country is occupied by the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese operated government, a Vietnamese installed government is running Cambodia. Furthermore, it's rather interesting, Vietnamese are engaged in a rather substantial settlement program. You hear a great deal about some Israeli settlers on the West Bank. There are more than 100,000, matter of fact, over 150,000 Vietnamese who have been settled in the best farmlands of Cambodia, and gradually they try, Vietnamese under their occupation of Cambodia, try to Vietnamize, that case, Cambodia. As far as Zimbabwe is concerned, we have a somewhat mixed situation in that the Mugabe government is moving in the direction of being increasingly moving toward a one-party system, but they haven't gotten there yet. And one has to await developments to make a determination as to exactly what the future of Zimbabwe is. There's a strange mixture at the same time of allowing a certain amount of dissenting views and opinions, and also dissenting groups still to continue to exist. Former Prime Minister Jan Smith is, after all, still functioning there and is a member of the Zimbabwe Parliament. Angola is, at this particular point, a dictatorship that is pretty much in line with the Soviet Union, and of course is propped up by a rather substantial Cuban presence in the country.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. The gentleman here in the second row has been waiting a long time. To everyone else, I apologize deeply. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on how you envision the balance between political participation, political stability, and economic development as it pertains to specifically the third world?
Would you comment upon social and economic development, especially with respect in the third world specifically?
Well, all right, this being the last question, let me try to deal with it briefly. There obviously is a correlation, and I think it is important to recognize that the excuse that we have to build up our economy first and let's put political development aside has not proved to be a good way of analyzing the problem. We happen to think that the two go hand in hand with each other. And let me also say in that connection that increasingly I've discovered in the third world, particularly in Africa, there's a recognition that state-run, state-operated, state-planned economic systems simply don't work, don't operate.
Mr. Ambassador, I know that with human rights, I think, becoming a more prominent part of American administrations and foreign policy, and with a sincere interest on the part of most, regardless of a variety of points of view in their success, I know that you have our best wishes as you proceed in this most important responsibility which you have. We very much appreciate the fact that you've taken your good and valuable time to come here to Baltimore and share your views with us in the cause of citizen discussion of foreign affairs. You have our very best wishes and our thanks.
Thank you very much.
It was good to have you join the members of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for this evening's session. A transcript of the program is available at a cost of $5. The Council is a private, non-profit, non-position-taking organization dedicated to foreign affairs education. Membership is open to the public, to all citizens seriously interested in foreign affairs. For membership information, merely call the Council at 727-2150 or write to Suite 2155 at the World Trade Center.